Our friend Dolphus Ramser was born and raised in Concord, North Carolina, a town so rich with history that it provided the inspiration for his independent record label and management company. So great was the city's influence on Ramser that he continues to live and work in Concord today with a full-time staff located in both North Carolina and California. He and his team always put their clients' music first, work as hard as they can, and have fun along the way. Visit ramser.com to learn more.
Welcome to The Road to Now, where we look to the past
and everywhere in between
to understand the present. I'm Bob Crawford, and joining me as always is Dr. Ben Sawyer. Ben, can you tell us about the guest we have today?
Sure can. We are talking with Vanderbilt scientists Jim Clarke and Steve Krahn. They are experts in nuclear energy. They have incredible backgrounds working in government, working for private organizations, and they have been working on nuclear energy and on nuclear sites for decades.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, Ben. I grew up in the shadow of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident that happened in the late 70s. And also, the first time I ever saw Bruce Springsteen perform live, saw a video of him actually performing, was on the No Nukes concert. So, when I grew up, there was a lot of animosity, a lot of fear, a lot of hesitation about nuclear power, and it was really a galvanizing moment for people that were against it. And so I've always wondered, has nuclear energy been given a fair shake in the United States? Is it something, why doesn't it work when it works so well in other countries? Why can't we figure out how to dispose of the waste properly? Why aren't we using it more if it's such a clean technology as many people say it is?
Right. And I think one of the lessons we've learned, as we talked about on the history of coal before this, is that politics are as important as technology in shaping the way we produce energy, and you see that with coal. You see that tremendously, and you also see it with nuclear. Dr. Steve Krahn, before he went to Vanderbilt, he served in the U.S. Department of Energy as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Safety and Security in the Office of Environmental Management. This guy knows what it's like to deal with this stuff, and he explained there are actually safe ways to do this, not completely, but the risk can be minimized if we do it correctly. And, when you listen to this episode, remember these folks have been doing it for a while. Listen and judge, but keep your mind open.
Yeah, we probably could not have found two better guests or experts to talk about this topic.
All right, Jim Clarke and Steve Krahn, welcome to The Road to Now. You are experts on nuclear energy. You both have been working on nuclear power for more than half of the existence of nuclear power. So this is incredible. Your histories are the history of the industry. We're looking at a time now where energy is a big point of debate in American society. And so we're doing this series on the history of energy and where it stands now. Could you tell us, where did this start? It seems like the debate over energy, it's coal versus sustainable energy, and that means wind and solar. Why are we not pursuing nuclear energy more intensely?
Well, I would think there's some politics associated with that. There is, nuclear energy actually came out of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons came first. And so there's that stigma associated with nuclear energy.
A lot of it depends on how you frame the discussion. There are a lot of terms thrown around in the energy discussion. You'll hear renewable, you'll hear sustainable, you'll hear clean energy. So depending upon what your goal for energy is, some of the answers may be different. For example, where you have biofuels are a renewable energy, but they're really not all that clean. Nuclear power, unless you recycle nuclear fuel, is not defined as a renewable energy, but from a carbon dioxide emission standpoint, it's as clean as wind power is.
Guys, I grew up very close to 3 Mile Island. I grew up in South Jersey, about 3 hours away from where that happened. I remember very clearly. It was just a few days before my 8th birthday.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The world has never known a day quite like today. It faced the considerable uncertainties and dangers of the worst nuclear power plant accident of the atomic age. And the horror tonight is that it could get much worse. It is not an atomic explosion that is feared. The experts say that is impossible. But the specter was raised of perhaps the next most serious kind of nuclear catastrophe, a massive release of radioactivity. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission cited that the potential is there for the ultimate risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
That skews my knowledge about what nuclear energy is and the potential dangers of it. But like you said at the outset, there have been very few accidents. What are the real dangers of nuclear energy?
Well, I think 3 Mile Island might be a good one to talk about for a bit, because 3 Mile Island was a large industrial accident. I mean, it produced the bankruptcy of a couple of companies, but there were no substantial radioactive releases associated with 3 Mile Island. One of the reactors had to be permanently defueled and shut down. So substantial impact on the utility in southern Pennsylvania there, but not a substantial impact on human health and safety or the environment.
Another thing, if I could, if you look at all of those accidents, it's invariably the case that the accidents were not caused by the system, they were not caused by the equipment, they were caused by people. And so right after 3 Mile Island, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission set up a new division called Human Factors, recognizing that it's the things the people do. Like in Chernobyl, they were playing games with the reactor, they were bringing it up and shutting it down. These accidents are not caused by systems.
The other thing that came out of 3 Mile Island was the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations, which was an organization that all of the utilities belong to, and its focus is on operational excellence. So it is set up to address just what Jim was mentioning, the fact that operators are part of the system, and they need to have the same amount of technical focus on them that designing a complex system has.
Nuclear energy has this problem. Most of humanity found out about it in 1945 when those bombs exploded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I have just returned from the White House, where it has just been announced that the United States is now using an atomic bomb, the most powerful explosive yet developed.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We won the race of discovery against the Germans. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
And it was the Manhattan Project. The production of power for your average citizen was not the goal of it. That was a later development that came from that. And combining that with the point you made about it being human error. And I was just listening yesterday. There's I can't remember the reporter's name, but he's been working for a year on accidents in nuclear facilities. The examples he gave in the interview were human error, them cutting off certain safety functions because they didn't like the beep, I think it was, that it made. People in Los Alamos recently putting rods too close together to take a picture. And these are those things that are a problem, but those things can have huge impacts. Kate Brown wrote a great book called Plutopia, and it compared the Mayak nuclear reactor that they built in the Soviet Union to the Hanford plant in Washington. And the Hanford plant was a disaster, and it was shotgunned by people. And even recently there were warnings there with leaks from I guess one of the containment centers. You, however, have lived for decades working on this. Are those problems that came out of those weapons days, are they solved now? Or are they something we should be less worried about?
Both Mayak and Hanford are fuel reprocessing plants. They're not reactors. So it's an important difference. Both they're chemical plants designed to take apart nuclear fuel and allow it to be either recycled or, in Hanford's case, removing the plutonium to be able to make nuclear weapons. So those are both chemical processing plants. The Mayak plant had a major chemical explosion a number of years ago, substantial radioactive contamination in the local area, and there were some deaths associated with that accident. Now, the challenges at Hanford are more environmental restoration related. I mean, we have 177 high-level waste tanks out at Hanford, of which 148 of them only have a single barrier in between the remaining waste and the environment. The rest of them have two barriers. I was actually interviewed on National Public Radio about the leak you're talking about last May, and that was a leak only in that it was a double shell tank and there was leakage from the primary shell to the secondary shell. So the design met its intent. It stopped the leak. The material was able to be recovered and put back into other high-level waste tanks. Now, that's not to say that there are not environmental restoration challenges out at Hanford. I mean, the 148 single-shell tanks, a number of them had leakage issues, and there is ongoing environmental monitoring required, and longer term there may be environmental restoration under those tanks that's necessary. But I think it's important for us to put things in their proper perspective. Mayak, huge accident, loss of life, broad-based radioactive contamination in Siberia. Hanford, no losses of human life. Challenges to ensure that we protect our environment the way that we expect our environment to be protected since the National Environmental Protection Act, especially NEPA. But the human health and safety issues are more ensuring that we don't get people exposed while we're remediating the environment.
So would it be fair to say that the problems that we're looking at Hanford, we've come further in terms of preventing those types of accidents? And also, you said that has to do with producing nuclear weapons. Is that type of process not required for nuclear energy?
Similar chemical processes, similar nuclear processes, but a different intended product. Material for weapons in the national security mission of the United States, nuclear power for energy production, and you design the reactors differently. You design a production reactor for weapons purposes not to produce a lot of heat. You want it to have a lot of neutrons absorbed to produce plutonium and tritium materials like that, whereas you optimize a power reactor to produce heat efficiently so you can produce steam and make electrical power.
I think it's fair to say that given the catastrophic nature of an accident, if it occurs, there has to be a real emphasis on making sure it doesn't occur. And I think that's one of the issues with nuclear power. The accidents have been either catastrophic or perceived to have been catastrophic.
I think one of the major thrusts of the nuclear industry has been to learn from the accidents that occur.
How many new reactors are being commissioned presently, and how many are about to go online or have just come online?
Well, you've raised an interesting challenge, because right now we are decommissioning them faster than we're bringing them online.
We is limited to the United States.
Yeah.
The TVA just brought on a reactor at Watts Bar last year that they had started building in the 1980s and finished construction. That was the first new quote unquote reactor to come online in the United States since the middle of the 1980s, right? And then we're building 2 new reactors at Plant Vogel in Georgia, and another 2 new reactors at the Summer site in South Carolina. And in the United States, that's it. If you look worldwide, I think that the Chinese have somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 reactors, nuclear reactors, actively under construction right now. And as you go down, Indians have a couple more. So it depends on where you are, much importantly in the maturity of your energy production system. I mean, right now the United States has had flat energy, electricity increase needs for quite some time, or very small. And that's a combination of more renewable energy coming online, better efforts on saving energy. Places like China and India are looking at the energy growth rates that the United States experienced in the 50s and 60s, 3 to 6% per year or more, whereas we have been flat. So right now we don't have substantial a need for large baseload plants as the Chinese and the Indians and others do.
Another challenge that nuclear power has is it is incredibly expensive to build and to license and everything. And you don't get a dime until you turn the plant on and start generating electricity. And it may take 8 to 10 years.
The U.S. Department of Energy about 5 years ago did a study about what was the maximum potential penetration of renewable energy into the U.S. power market. And under the most favorable assumptions, it could reach, if we completed interconnecting the grid in all of the United States, which is an extraordinarily expensive capital investment, they thought it could reach as much as 70 to 80%, but then you would still need a clean source of base load power to be able to fully exploit wind and solar to their maximum extent, because there are often extended periods of darkness. We call it night. There are cloudy days, and there are days, even in the windiest parts of the United States, where you don't get enough wind energy to operate wind turbines. You know what the Department of Energy has been working on for a long time, for the last decade or so, is to have a balanced approach to power research and energy development, so that we have the ability to maximize our use of renewable and clean energy, and be able to move towards not having electricity be a huge amount of the carbon footprint of our energy use.
When you look at nuclear, would it be fair to say, like, it's the reason most people don't put solar panels on their houses, even though over the long term they'd pay off more? It's because of that bulk investment up front, and it's easier for us to pay more every month over the long period. So when you look at nuclear energy production, and I think that's an interesting point, because most people don't differentiate between the energy we use in our houses and energy as a whole. And that's brilliant. So when we look at the energy that we use in our houses, you say that sustainable energies could work out. You know, in an ideal world where we maximize sustainable, where do you think nuclear fits in that? Is it an important part of it? When we look at nuclear, should we imagine sustainable doing what it can and then nuclear totally replacing coal? Would that be a better thing?
So if you look at the energy needs of the country, there are energy sources that are transportable or even portable, and there are energy sources that are not. So transportation, until we get to further along in electric vehicles than we are right now, needs a transportable power source. Electricity generation does not need a transportable power source. So I think that's one of the important things to keep in the forefront of your mind, with understanding that electric generation is only a part of the solution. And some of these other, what are presently feedstocks for energy, also have the potential to be feedstocks for chemical industry, for example. I mean, when we were burning oil for electric power, which we were until a decade or so ago, oil is, the basis for gasoline, for many petrochemicals. So one of the challenges of being in a free market economy is that we don't have people directing other people not to use one type of energy source or another source, even when intellectually you could say, gee, this may not be the best use of this asset.
Nuclear waste disposal is a major issue. It comes up a lot, seems to be controversial. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It is possible to chemically treat used nuclear fuel, remove both the uranium and plutonium from it, and reuse that. It's an option we don't presently pursue in the United States.
Why don't we do it?
Well, non-proliferation. The practical concern is that a recycling plant for nuclear fuel is an enormous reinforced concrete structure that the equipment is behind shielded enclosures, and it's not easy to access.
But there is something called the nuclear fuel cycle, and it starts out with mining uranium, and then there are different ways you can get the uranium, and then taking it through all the steps to make it usable for a fuel, in a nuclear power plant, and then looking at the fuel that comes out of the nuclear power plant, how it has to be stored. It's very hot, both thermally and radioactivity. And so it has to be stored usually in a pool for 3 to 5 years, and then it can be stored above ground. And then it can either be reused, recycled, or it goes to a geologic repository that we don't have. We spent a lot of money looking at Yucca Mountain. That got political, that got canned. It may come back.
I think there's a lot of fear with nuclear waste, and I'm coming at this from someone who, until today, knows very little about nuclear energy, right? I know buzzwords. I know Yucca Mountain. I know like 3 Mile Island. I know things that are in the cultural consciousness. So it's great that we have you guys here to explain it for us who are ignorant about this. So if I live in a town, if I live in Yucca Mountain, what fears do I have about nuclear waste being stored there? And if I live in one of these towns that the train that carries the nuclear waste from the facility to the waste repository, what fears should we have in these on the way towns about a train accident, about, just whatever?
Let me try one aspect of that to start with, the cost aspect. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 put in place the Nuclear Waste Fund. And the Nuclear Waste Fund is paid for by users of electricity generated by nuclear power. And that fund puts aside 1 mil, so 1,000th of a dollar for every kilowatt hour of energy generated into a fund that the United States is supposed to use to work on spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste disposal. Jim mentioned Yucca Mountain. I mean, Yucca Mountain was the place where we were going to put one of our nuclear waste repositories. A lot of people don't know that the intent was only to build a number of them, so you didn't have the people of Nevada having the only nuclear waste repository. It was just intended under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to be the first. And one of the challenges for the citizens of Nevada was that the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was changed in 1987 to direct the Department of Energy only to look at Yucca Mountain so that they would get the first repository built, constructed, and operated.
As Bob said, people were obviously concerned. But let me follow up on that question he asked. Should they be concerned? And what are the costs that they would bear and the problems that would be caused by that?
Can I ask it another way, Ben? Would you guys want a nuclear waste repository in your town?
Well, I can say that having served in the United States Navy, I've slept and ate next to a nuclear reactor for extended amounts of time. So I understand that the risks associated with the technology. The disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste has been studied going back to the mid-1950s. And deep geological disposal has been the consensus method for dealing with high-level waste since fairly early on. And I would say that if there's substantial international consensus on that being the overall approach. So what that then takes you to are geology and engineering questions. And how do you combine a geology and a waste container to provide the amount of protection required over long periods of time?
President Obama's proposed budget contains huge amounts of spending, but not for everything. For example, there is no funding to dispose of the waste from nuclear power plants. The president is keeping a campaign promise by stopping the $8 billion project to prepare Yucca Mountain, Nevada, as the country's nuclear waste repository.
When President Obama shut down the Yucca Mountain project, he started up a commission, the Blue Ribbon Commission on the U.S. nuclear future, and one of their jobs was to provide advice to avoid the type of policy issues that it was their opinion existed on Yucca Mountain. And one of the major recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission, based on the experience of the Swedes and the French and the South Koreans, was You needed to combine engineering and hard physical science with social science to get communities to understand what risk they were undertaking if they had a disposal facility sited in their community, and what types of long-term programs needed to be put in place to ensure that that isolation continued to be effective.
We actually do have a geologic repository, and it's operating. It's in New Mexico, and it handles a certain type of waste called transuranic waste. It's actually deeper, I think, than Yucca Mountain would have been. And it had some difficulties a few years ago, but it has since, come back and brought that, and I believe it's open again.
There are a number of factors in judging where the right place to put a repository is. As the Blue Ribbon Commission reminded us in their report, you have to get consensus from the community. The communities have to see that there is an advantage to them to having this facility sited in their community.
One of the things I like to tell the students is we can give you the science and we can give you the engineering, but the reality is it leaves the scientific and the engineering arenas quickly, and then you get into everything else. You get into the politics, you get into risk perception, you get into all these other things that have to be managed.
So Jim, how did you decide to dedicate your life to studying this topic?
I came to Nashville out of graduate school in the early 70s. I had a postdoctoral research appointment at Vanderbilt doing theoretical chemical physics. And the guy I was working with was also very interested in environmental issues. This was in the early 70s when all the laws were getting passed, and it was a very exciting time. So I had hoped to be a professor. I couldn't find an academic job, but I did find a job in a research institute, also at Vanderbilt, operated by another professor, and ended up going to work with a company that several of the professors had founded. Worked with that company for several years and eventually retired. We sold it. I was the chief executive officer and the president. We were doing chemical waste. The clients were, major petroleum refineries, chemical companies. And then I had an opportunity to join a National Academy committee. It was called the Committee on Buried and Tank Waste. And it was a combination of committees that had existed before in Idaho, where they had a lot of buried waste, and Hanford, where they had a lot of tank waste. And that was an incredible experience. It took me all around to all the DOE sites, all the nuclear waste problems, all those issues. And then and I did that while I was with this company, and then we had an opportunity to sell the company. And I sold the company. I stayed with the people who bought us for 2 years, and then I had an opportunity to come to Vanderbilt as a professor. It couldn't have worked out any better. And then Steve joined us, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years ago, and he and I have been partners in the nuclear waste efforts since then.
And Steve, how did you get involved in a project like this? How did you come to find this as your area of interest?
Well, I was selected for the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program right out of the University of Wisconsin. Went to work for Admiral Rickover on his technical staff. I was there from 1978 until Admiral Rickover left in 1982.
When you were a kid growing up, did you think one day I want to stay for months underneath the water next to a nuclear reactor? Or did that
That would not have been a high in my choice, and I wasn't in ROTC or anything like that. I mean, I just was kind of a volunteer off the street. I took the interview, and my dad had been at the Bettis Atomic Power Lab, which is part of the nuclear propulsion program. I took the interview and I said, well, would this be a great job? And he said, well, at Bettis, we didn't like those guys, but we always thought they were pretty smart. So that must mean something about you.
That's great. That's great.
What is the Trump administration's policy on nuclear energy? And you mentioned the EPA being involved, Scott Pruitt, EPA Secretary, and Rick Perry, Energy Secretary. What is their opinion on nuclear energy and its future in America?
I think it's probably too early to tell, but I don't, they've authorized in the budget things that support the kinds of things we've been we've been talking about. They did authorize a Yucca Mountain revisit.
They have said some positive things about nuclear power. They've also, their initial budget cut some programs that support nuclear power that kind of surprised people. So I think there'll be some ongoing conversation between Congress and the administration to determine what it is exactly they want to do. I think there's some inconsistencies between what they're saying and doing, but this is the only area where that's true for sure.
Well, I'll also say I've only heard Donald Trump call one form of energy production beautiful, and it was not nuclear. Beautiful coal.
Well, guys, I want to thank you guys for being on the show today. You win the award for the smartest guests ever on the road to now.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
We appreciate you sitting down with a couple schmoes like us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta. Edited by Bob Crawford and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.